Hello, my name is John Peters. I'm a retired physician, but I taught college biology before going on to medical school. And one of the foundational concepts is evolution. Uh, many years ago, I found that how it was presented and the evidence for accepting evolution was not quite what people wanted. Most students and the laypersons want to have major changes explained, reptiles to mammals and fish to amphibians, et cetera. They would like to have that evidence laid out for them rather than a lot of the what are termed micro changes that are usually presented. And so I think whale evolution has come to the point where when you look at all of it, all the evidence from multiple lines, it's inescapable and overwhelming that whales have evolved. How they did it through the mechanisms in 10 million years is a different story. But we do have the evidence in front of us now that should be irrefutable to most people. So this part 2 of 3 is going to take a look at fossil evidence, which I think most people are very interested in. Part 1 was looking at the living whales and dolphins, the cetaceans, and how we can tell that they evolved from a small land animal. And then part 3 is going to be looking at DNA evidence that a lot of people have not seen. But let's go ahead and bring up the slides so we can kind of dive into the evidence for whale evolution from fossils. Okay, so this is the opening slide that you saw in part 1. It's a Dorudon fossil found in Egypt. You can see how complete it is, and it's amazing they can find these that are that well assembled for them. This is a basilosaurid type species that was very cosmopolitan and found around the world. So I just want to briefly go over some opening remarks that were in part 1. There are many potential objections to looking at these evidence. And although most of them are religious, some are not. And that evolution as a concept, I think, is counterintuitive for many people. How do you go from very basics in the fossil record up to very complex animals and us over a period of time, and how did that happen? And what is the evidence that we have for it? So I've chosen the whale evolution because I think it's overwhelming, all the evidence that you can look at. And again, part 2 here of 3 is going to be looking at the fossil evidence. So these are the macro changes that people want to see. They may be interested in one squirrel species giving rise to another squirrel species, but what people, I think, really want to see is, okay, what's the evidence for a large scale evolution and change in populations? And so I think whale evolution will satisfy that. So why should you be looking at these 3 series? What makes this different from the other whale evidence? I think that it's very comprehensive what I put together. I don't think you're going to find all of this evidence that I'm presenting in 3 parts anywhere that I've ever seen. None of it is original to me. I've just been able to do a lot of research as to why and how scientists know whales evolved. And so most of this should be new to you. Please pause the slides anytime you want. There should be citations. You may want to look at the photos or the observations and data a little bit more closely. And again, these are 3 parts. Hopefully at the end, if you have doubts about evolution, whale evolution will be a very good example for you. And then you can go on and look at all the other evidence there is from DNA and biogeography and just all the different fields that are out there. So let's keep going here. This is a very common slide showing the development of whales as they evolved. And let's look at the right side first. You'll notice that it has millions of years at the top, and it starts out close to 55 million years ago. And the first proto-whale is Indohyus. We're going to discuss how scientists know that that was actually on the lineage for whales. And then you can see there's Pakicetus, Amblyocetus, Cutiocetus, Rhodocetus. There's Dorudon that we've been talking about. And then we get to the toothed whales of today and the baleen whales at the bottom. So the first thing you notice is that there is no line going between Indohyus and Pakicetus, Pakicetus to Amblyocetus, etc. They shared a common ancestor, but these are not Indohyus did not give rise to Pakicetus. Pakicetus did not give rise to Amblyscetus. This is a common misnomer when looking at phylogenetic trees like this. It's not a ladder. On the right side over here, you can see skull changes that we're going to be talking about. And you can also just see from this that the hind limbs are beginning to shrink as we go down. And then, of course, when we get to the toothed whales and the baleen whales, they don't have any hind limbs except for the atavisms that we talked about in part 1. And we showed you how some whales can actually grow hind limbs that communicate with their vestigial pelvis. So if you missed part 1, please do go and see that. All right, so these are just a few representative species. Remember, there's over 220 of them. And so we need to be able to read this graph, phylogenetic tree, properly. And there are no lines going between them. But if you look over to the left, you can see there's a node right here. And these are the suspected and predicted common ancestors of these as they begin to change through time, these different populations. So at the time that Indohyus and the precursor for that, notice that there, as it says here, that there's a thick bony wall around the middle ear. And also, we're going to look at that. It's called the involucrum. And it's very important to know this, but we'll take a look at it a little bit in a few slides. But also, you can also look at the bones and the enamel and figure out by the isotopes that are in there, whether they were freshwater or semi-aquatic habitat. And so, again, these changes you're going to see, and we'll look at them a little bit more carefully. So the common ancestor to the Amblyscetus and some of the other whales here, the tail begins to become much stronger and longer. The legs begin to shrink. The fat pad in the jaw for hearing underwater and echolocation is beginning to form. And they're moving out of the tidewater and freshwater areas and into brackish water and along the seacoast. Again, we know that because of the fossils that they were found with pollen and other plants, but also you can do isotope analysis, which we'll look at and know from the teeth and the bones what's going on. And then by the time we get down into the ancestors of Cucucetus, Rhodocetus, and a lot of other whales, they're now in the saltwater habitat. And indeed, Dorudon and other basilosaurids are found all over the world at this level here. And you can also see that the nasal passageway here for Rhodocetus is pretty close to the tip. And then when you get to Dorudon, it's moving upwards, and we'll take a look at that. So again, the tail flukes are getting larger. The hind limbs are beginning to shrink. The nasal passageway is migrating backwards. Echolocation for hunting is evolving in the toothed whales, and then the baleen evolves later on in the Mycetes. And so we're going to take a look at that. It's really amazing stuff that they found. The scientists studying all these different whales fossils. Okay, on the left side over here, this is the things that we're going to note as you go through the fossil records. The legs shrink, the nasal hole migrates. We'll talk about middle ear changes, et cetera, and some of these things as we go on. All right, so if we take a look at a Basilosaurus fossil that was found, this one here on the left is pretty typical. You'll notice that this particular one, they didn't find the tail, so the vertebrae end here, but there have been so many other ones that have found that that's not a problem. And then when you find these fossils, you'll note that there's a group of bones that are really close to the spine, but they're not communicating directly with the spine. They kind of sit out in the blubber area. And if you blow that up and expand it and drill down on it, you can see that there's some bones here. There's 2 bones here. There's some foot bones. And so if we actually get a photograph of that, which you can see over here is the hind limb. So this right here is a diagram of what you see here on the right. And then this, most people would recognize. Here's the kneecap. This is the femur. The 2 bones in the lower leg that you have are the tibia and the fibula. And then here's some foot bones. in this fossil whale. So this is just a remnant. It's a vestigial leg. It's, as far as we know, it's not doing much of anything, but it harkens back to obviously when these ancestors of these whales were walking on land. And again, sometimes you could even get the vestigial pelvis here on the left. You can see it's a ball and socket joint, and the vestigial femur is actually fitting into the hip joint there. Now, it's very interesting that when these fossils were found early on in the late 1800s, they began to notice right away that these were probably, these whale fossils were related in some way to ungulates like deer and cattle. And the reason why they know that is if you take a look at these foot bones here, there's a bone called the astragalus, which is a fused bone. Here's your tibia and fibula, your lower bones in your lower leg. But this is found with a hook on it because it's a pulley system that deer and cow use to walk more efficiently. And sure enough, this whale has a vestigial set of bones out here communicating with the vestigial pelvis, and it harkens back to an ancestor that was actually living on land. And so we know, even at a very early stage, before even the year 1900, they knew that whales had evolved probably from artiodactylids and even toad. Okay, so I mentioned on the previous slide that one of the ways that we would expect if whales evolved is that you would see the nostrils, which starts out as two openings, and the fetus that we looked at in part one, and it actually migrates up. You can actually see it in the fossil record moving up to its present point, which is a blowhole. And so here's the Amazon dolphin. Notice it has two openings in the blowhole, not one, because it developed through time, through evolution, from a nose in the more ancestral form. And then I have had some people complain that this is just a diagram, it really doesn't exist. So I went and found, here's a museum, and the museum even has you can see the blowhole, what's going to become the blowhole, migrating up nicely in this sequence. And these fossils, of course, are in the current, and not current, the expected layers of the fossil record. So you don't see this one as an older one. This is the oldest one, and it's actually in series, just as one would predict. All right, so I mentioned these middle ear changes. This is extremely important because it turns out that whales and everything that are derived from them have a very special middle ear that no other line of animals have. And what it's called is in the involucrum. If you look here to the left, this is a deer. The tympanic bulla is the middle ear section that holds the incus and the stapes and the malleus that we all have. But in humans and all other animals, deer, etc., the medial aspect of the tympanic bone is thin. But in whales, they needed to have a thick side to protect it because they were using other means of hearing rather than a regular ear. And so if you look at these two in the middle on the right, these are living whales species. This is a right whale and I think a fin whale. And then these up at the top and the two at the bottom are fossil whale species. And if you find the tympanic bulla, the area of the middle ear, with an involucrum, which is an enlarged, thickened medial wall of the tympanic bulla, you know you have a whale species. And Indohyus, which is a terrestrial animal that was walking on land, had a primitive formation of a involucrum. So every whale fossil species, every living cetacean and whale and dolphin have an involucrum. It's species specific to the entire whale line. And that's why Pakicetus, Amblicitus, and going farther inland to these distant past ancestors of whales that were on land, we know that they're in the line because they have involucrums. Okay, so we've talked about the legs shrinking as whales evolved. The nasal hole migrates in the fossil record up towards the blowhole situation. Middle ear changes, they all had an involucrum. And also, when whales are fossilized, they fossilize around the world if they were in cosmopolitan. And so when you get to the basalosaurids, they're found all over the world. They're in seawater, the marine fossil species. But if you go back to Indohyus and Pakicetus, their biogeography is much more limited, and you find them fossilized in shoreline and in terrestrial habitats. So the paleobiography knows the distribution of whale species matches the fossil record, where you have older species that are found on land or near land, and then as you move into the marine environments, you get closer to the whales that we have today. They're also, it's a paleo environment. They're fossilized with also pollen and plant material and other species. And so you can tell the fossil, what is fossilized around it also to determine where it is. And this also matches as the whales move from land out into the marine environments. You can also look at the paleo environment. And so again, we're just adding more and more evidence that fits with our story of whales evolving from a small terrestrial animal. The other thing you can do is you can look at the teeth. As many of you know, the one thing that fossilizes better than anything in the animal kingdom are teeth. And so it turns out that there are several isotopes of water, of oxygen, and the heavier isotope, oxygen 18, is found in seawater, and the lighter isotope of oxygen, oxygen 16, is found in freshwater. And so as the whales evolved and moved away from the tidal areas in the brackish and into more of a marine environment, the oxygen that they took up to make their enamel and their teeth changed. And sure enough, if you look at oxygen 18 to oxygen 16 ratios, the fossils that were more marine match the heavier isotope oxygen. And so again, just another evidence, a line of evidence that we're on the right track with what really happened with whales. All right, and then we mentioned this in part one, that you can look at the anatomical bones of whales, and they have a vestigial pelvis that is not connected to the spine anymore, but they still have some bones. And there's a human pelvis here to the left, so that you can remember that the ilium are those large wings that you sit on your ischium. Here's the ilium here. Here's the ischial bones. There is an obturator opening called an obturator foramen. The pubis, the suprapubic area here, the sacrum, the coccyx, etc. You can identify these vestigial pelvis parts if you're a paleontologist very well. And here I have on the right side, there's Indohyus, Pakicetus, Amblyocetus, and Basilosaurus. And these are their vestigial pelvis. And professional anatomists can look at these and identify, for example, in Amblyocetus, here's the ilium, the ischium, the pubis, the pubic symphysis, which you see over here, right here on this slide of a modern human, the obturator foramen, and here's the acetabulum. That's the cup that the hip, the femur fits into. So these whales not only have a vestigial pelvis, but you can also see it changing through time with the different whale species. Good evidence that the ancestors of whales walked on land. All right, so what we'd really like to see, I think, is some transitional fossils, and it's been an amazing last 20 years. So this is an example of a species looking at the upper jaw, and this is a toothed whale. You can see over here the teeth, but they went back and looked at the specimen later on, many years later, and they realized that there were grooves in the skull, and also small openings. And an anatomist knows that this means that there are nerves and arteries running through there to nourish what must have been baleen. That's the best explanation for this. And so we have a transitional whale that's going from a toothed whale to a baleen whale. So all whales today have evolved from a toothed whale ancestor, and the baleen have lost their teeth, except you remember in part one, I showed you a fetal whale that had been dissected showing the tooth buds. And so here we have an artist rendition, and there's baleen beginning to form between the teeth, which are still present. And here's the citation if you want to read about it. But soon after this, we have even more species of whales that come out, and I've given you 3 more. These are all whale species that have been identified as intermediate between the toothed whales and the baleen whales. And if you would like to pause the slideshow here, you can read these snippets and summaries here. This is really exciting. This is what people want. They want to see where are the transitional fossils showing how baleen whales evolved. And we have them. We have, I think, 6 of them here that I'm going to present. And so lots of evidence that what scientists predicted we would find, we are now finding. Here's another 2 that were found. And this one was very exciting. This was I think a whale that was found in Peru, 43 million years old. And the authors claim, rightly so, that it's a true immediate form. It could swim. They know this by looking at the pelvis. It had a long tail, and the bones indicate that it had the rear feet were webbed. But it could also walk. They looked at the fore and hind limbs and knew that the musculature and the type of bones, the pelvis was attached to the sacrum. Remember that in whales today, the vestigial pelvis just sits out in the blubber area, although it does have a function in males for reproduction, a different function. But they could tell from this whale, P. pacificus, that the femur insertion, and it still had hooves and fingers and a flat tip on the tail, on the feet, that it was intermediate. It was both swimming and also could still walk. And then there was another one also that was found a little bit sooner, that 35 million years ago, that had a vertebral column that indicate that the tail was powerful for swimming. And again, you can look these up if you'd like. Great evidence for transition between a toothed whale and the baleen whales. Okay, so the last thing I'd like to mention is that in 2015, there was quite some excitement in the anti-evolutionist areas, because there had been a claim that somebody found a basilosaurid that was very recent. It was out of the sequence of dates, and so that got picked up. I went and looked, and I could not find any peer-reviewed articles. It was just a popular lay article that 2 researchers in Antarctica found. And so what I did was I wrote an email to Dr. Thuyssen and Dr. Gingerich, who are the top 2 whale researchers in the world. And they wrote back and saying that it just doesn't seem to match. Nothing's been peer reviewed, and it would be highly untrue. And I don't believe that after that announcement was made, that there's been anything that I can find. And so if you run across somebody who asks about the Antarctic supposedly Basilosaurus whale fossil that was out of sequence where it should have found, you've got this 2 emails that they sent back to me that said that that's really not true. And I would also like to note that Dr. Thuyssen is a professor of anatomy at a medical school. And so evolution is so true that you can't understand human anatomy properly, whether it's the recurrent laryngeal nerve or the vestigial ear muscles that hold your outer ear to your head. In humans, without understanding evolution, where our ancestors came from. And so here you have Dr. Thuyssen, who's teaching medical students, but he's a cetacean paleontologist, but the medical school is paying him to teach medical students anatomy. And the other person I can think of is Neil Shubin, who wrote the book Your Inner Fish, who is also he's a fish paleontologist, but he also teaches anatomy to medical students because you can't understand fully human anatomy without our past and where we came from in terms of evolution. So there are fish paleontologists and whale paleontologists teaching at some of the top medical schools in the world because they can lay that foundation of why we can look at humans and know that we've also evolved. Okay, that ends part 2. I want to thank you so much. Part 3 is going to be on DNA evidence, which we're going to look at the actual codes, the DNA code for certain proteins and even transposons, which I suspect that almost no one has really looked at those before. And so I found them. Thank you so much for watching, and I'm hoping that you're going to if you haven't seen part 1, and stick with me for part 3, which will also have some summary comments.